Hello, Stats class. This is the second lesson on experiments. It's called Principles of Experimentation, lesson 4.2b. And I'm going to start with an example this time. And I'm going to start with how to do it wrong, and then we'll make it better with a few more things. So, suppose our goal is to improve SAT scores in a group of students. And I'm going to start by saying, what if we decide that maybe taking an SAT prep class might help them? So we're going to take this group of students and give them an SAT prep class and look at their scores to see if they're good. And here's another situation where if we were in class, I would ask you to tell me, what's wrong with that? That's a great idea, isn't it? Maybe that'll help. And it's kind of hard to tell how it would help exactly, because if these are students who've already taken the SAT, and then we're going to look to see if their scores are better than before, well, maybe they would have been better than before just from taking it a second time without the prep class. Or maybe we're going to look at their scores compared to a different population that didn't take the prep class, but there's a lot of possible confounding variables here. So if you think about letting them choose to be in the prep class, who's going to choose? It's the motivated people, and maybe their scores would have been better anyway. So this, as an observational study, is not probably a good idea. So it would be better to make it an experiment. If I really want to know if this class makes a difference, then I have to, actually, I'm going to take it back. I'm not going to experiment yet. First, I'm just going to say, let's make some of them take the class. This is still slightly better to have some who take the class and some who don't. Students who don't take the class. And I would take those two groups of students and compare their scores. But again, if I'm not telling them to take the class or not, then I have some confounding variables involved with that. So if I say it this way and I just say I take some who took the class of their own choice and those who chose not to, that's still an observational study. Because we let them choose which group to go into. If we let them choose, then something about those people who chose the class might make them also be the sort of student that would score better anyway. So that's not so good because we have some problems with that. Specifically, confounding variables. Remember those confounded variables, they just mess up my study completely. For instance, motivation. Those who are strongly motivated might take the class, and they also might do better because they're motivated. It might be about their IQ, natural intelligence. It might be about their test anxiety and whether the class helps with their test anxiety. There's a lot of things that could happen. I'm going to put etc. because there's a lot of confounding variables here. There's also some questions I have about this. It's not very clear how many students did they do. If you do one of each, that's not probably enough to make conclusions from. So if you have one student who took the class and one who didn't, and you're just talking to your friend who didn't take the class and saying, haha, my score is better because I took the class, that's not enough information, right? So how many students makes a difference? And then the biggest difference is there's no random assignment yet. So we're going to make it better again. And because there's no random assignment, I can't tell if these confounding variables are actually causing the better scores for one group or not. So still better would be to change this to an experiment. An experiment will always give you better results than an observational study because you're causing something to happen. And so I would want to find not just one or two, but lots of students. So let's say I go out recruiting and I find 100 students who are willing to participate. It's very common with experiments to use volunteers, and it is okay to use volunteers. Maybe you could guess why. It's because we're going to do something random to the volunteers. So you start with people who are willing to have that happen to them, right? Willing to do what you tell them to do. And let's say I get my 100 students and I'm going to randomly assign them into one of two groups. And I'm going to tell them either you are going to be in the 50 people who take the class, or I tell them they're not going to take the class. So this is why you need volunteers, 50 who don't take the prep class. And maybe you tell them to study on their own for a same amount of time or something like that. You tell them something. You don't just let them be totally free to do whatever they want. I should have said on their own. And then you compare the scores for the two groups. So these diagrams actually really help me. On the AP test, you never have to draw one of these diagrams. They're more expecting you to write a paragraph explaining what you would do, but all the things in the diagram should be in your paragraph somewhere. You should say randomly assign. You should say these ones do this and these ones do that, and then what are you going to compare at the end? So that's the basic structure of an experiment. And the reason why we are randomly assigning, I talked about this a little bit in 4.2a, but I want to make it even more clear right now. Why are we randomly assigning? We're doing it to reduce the confounding. So that's the main reason. And the way we're reducing confounding is we're trying to make it so the reason they're in this group is not because of anything else that might be causing a good score or a bad score. None of these things are part of it. We are trying to make the two groups as alike to each other as possible, or in other words, make them be well mixed within each group. Make the two groups well mixed, kind of like a cluster sample. Heterogeneous is the official word for that. We don't want all the smart people to be in the prep class and all the dumb people to not be in the prep class. That's a mean way of saying it, but it's true. We don't want all of the people in one group to be the same in some way, because then that sameness might be the reason for the better scores. So the idea is to make the two groups be well mixed so that each group represents the population well, which should sound familiar out of sampling that we've been doing. And then once we have done that, once we've randomly assigned them so that they represent the population well, then if this group gets better scores, we can assume it's because of the treatment and not because of some other factor. So we want, this is the most important part probably, we want the treatment to be the only major difference between the groups. And you've probably seen something like that with science classes before. If you're doing an experiment, for instance, in biology with plants, and you're trying out 2 different fertilizers on your 2 different plants, you want everything else to be the same. You want the same amount of water, the same amount of light, the same quality of soil for both plants, so that the only difference is that fertilizer. And that is one of the principles of a good experiment that we're about to talk about. So that's an example to talk about. The worst way is just take some people and give them a class and see what happens. Slightly better is take some people who took the class and some more people who didn't take the class. Better than that is to randomly assign them, and that's what allows you to assume that the class is what's causing those scores to be better. So to summarize, I started with an example, but now let's summarize the principles of the experimental design, things that should always happen in every single experiment. And that is what this chapter really is about, how to design an experiment or a survey or a sample in a way that will give you good results. And so we started the first half of the chapter 4.1 was on surveys, and now we're doing experiments. How do you set up a good experiment? I already told you the most important thing, which starts with R. If we were in class, I would make you tell me, and you would all shout out at the same time, random. we have to have random assignment of treatments. Why? Because it reduces confounding and lurking variables. They are almost the same thing, not quite the same thing. I'll write them down and then I'll explain again how they're different. So officially, confounding variables is when you have two different variables that might be causing your response variable. Lurking is when it is a variable that causes the explanatory variable and the response variable. So it's really almost the same thing. I don't think it is super important that you know the difference between these as long as you can describe what's happening. But the lurking variables might be things that I can't control. For instance, the IQ of the people in my study there's nothing I can do to make that be exactly the same in both groups. Or sometimes it's things I just didn't even notice. I didn't know that this person happened to be better at English and so therefore is going to get a better English score anyway, and I wouldn't have known that in advance. So lurking variables are usually things that you either can't control or you didn't notice, and confounding variables, if you notice them, there are things you can do about them, which are in later lessons. So I guess maybe that's one of the differences. The second principle that should be in every single experiment is called control. And control means a couple different things, and they're both important. So I'll talk about that. And control, anything that I can make the same, I will make the same. And I talked about this a minute ago with the plants. I want anything that could be a confounding variable to be the same between both groups. So with the SAT prep class, maybe the amount of time that the one group spends in the prep class, I would tell the other group that they need to practice for that amount of time on their own. So practice time or study time could be something I could control and try to make the same for both groups. Remember, they've volunteered to be in my experiment, so they're going to do whatever I tell them, right? In an ideal world. If you really want to be picky about it, if it's a medical thing, you keep them in your facility for a while and you make them do the same things at the same time. If you're dealing with plants, like I said, you want them to have the same water, same soil, same temperature, same light, so that the only difference is whatever it is you're trying to measure, which would be maybe a fertilizer or something like that. So that sort of thing is called control. Control all the other variables that might be lurking. And then the other thing that control means, it means both control all the other variables, and it also means you want something called a control group or a comparison group. And this is back to the very beginning of these notes. I said, don't just take a group of people and put them in a class. You need another group that doesn't take the class. If you don't have that other group, you have nothing to compare with. And so the control group would be if a group gets no treatment at all, no class at all, or something like that, or the plant gets no fertilizer or something like that. Comparison group is if you have an old way and a new way and you want to compare them. This is done all the time with medication type tests. You might have the standard medication that you've used for years versus the new one. And you don't want to have anybody go without the medication. That doesn't seem ethical, right? So you don't say, okay, you guys are going to just have no painkiller for your headache and you guys get to have a painkiller. No, instead you take the old painkiller and the new painkiller and compare to see which one is better. And this no treatment thing, if you're dealing with people, it's very common to give them what's called a placebo, which we'll talk about some more in another set of notes also, but I'll mention it today. It's a fake treatment that makes them feel like they're getting something even when they're not. To make them think they're being treated, and there's some psychological consequences of that. Usually it's a pill with no medicine in it. Because people, and with animals and plants, you don't have to worry about that. But with people, if they think they're getting a treatment, they're likely to feel better just because they think they're in an experiment. And like, oh gosh, even if you don't tell them they're in the placebo group, because that would be crazy. I'm pretty sure that's in another lesson, so I'm not going to talk about it more right now, but that's something that's commonly done. Control means, first of all, I make everything I can make the same between the two groups, I do. And then the other thing is I always have at least two groups. You never have only one group that gets the treatment and nothing to compare them with. And then the third one is another R, which stands for replication. Replication I hinted at above, where I said, what if you just are talking to your friend and you took the class and they didn't take the class? That's only one subject in each group. Not enough. You need many subjects. Larger sample sizes if you're dealing with samples, but in experiments, you need larger treatment groups. Many subjects, bigger groups. Which makes you more certain that what you're seeing is not just by chance. It's because of the treatments. So there's a couple of things that might happen. If you don't have enough subjects, it could be that the thing you're observing that's the difference between the two subjects or two small groups is a confounding variable. Or it could be that it's just an accident, that you accidentally put the smarter person in this group and they got a better score. So we're trying to distinguish between the treatment effect versus confounding versus accident or random effects. And then you may have seen this in science classes also. Replication in science usually is used to mean doing the whole experiment again. So like if you read something done by a scientist and you wonder if it really works, you would do the experiment again. That's also another meaning of replication. I'm going to put it in parentheses. That's not what's usually meant with stats. So doing the whole experiment again is not what the stats book is talking about when they say replication. They're talking about making sure that it applies to many subjects. Although I suppose doing the whole experiment again would give you more subjects. It's just you might as well get more subjects in the first place. If you have enough subjects the first time, you don't need to do it again, although you always could if you weren't sure. So those are the three principles. Every single experiment should have all three of these. There's a fourth one that's not every single experiment, but also a good idea, and we will learn that in a later lesson. So this is one of those chapters where I feel like there's a lot more I haven't told you yet. This is enough for today. So we'll stop here, and then in 4.2 C and D, we'll learn some more. Exciting.